Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is one of the nation's leading advocates for restraint. Elected to the U.S. Senate first in 2010, Senator Paul has fought tirelessly to return government to its limited constitutional scope, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. Senator Paul is a surgeon by trade. He founded the Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic, an organization that provides eye exams and surgery to needy families and individuals. And he continues to perform pro bono eye surgeries for patients across Kentucky and across the globe. As a doctor, Senator Paul was trained to diagnose patients and offer solutions. And as a senator, he diagnoses our nation's problems, our ailing of constitutional liberties, dizzying fiscal irresponsibility, and the gluttony of our foreign policy establishment. And he offers practical solutions. He is perhaps Congress's leading voice for foreign policy marked by realism and restraint. He's been a longtime friend of our work at the American Conservative. I believe it was 2018 when he spoke right here at our conference that year. And we are delighted and honored to have him back here again this year. Please join me in welcoming Senator Rand Paul.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Congress finally voted to end a war. The bad news is the war they voted to end had already been over for about 15 years. I think it was a good idea to have the discussion. It's better than not having the discussion. We had this discussion about ending the Iraq War. Well, the Iraq War has been over for probably 15 years or so, so the vote was largely symbolic. But it shows you how disconnected the people are in Washington, that even though the war's been over for 15 years, even though the war resolution specifically mentioned Saddam Hussein and his government, we still had trouble with people, a lot of Republicans in fact, but alarmed and saying, well, how could we possibly do this? And saying, what about Iran? What about Iran? One person wanted to put an amendment in there to say, but nothing in this resolution stops us from attacking Iran. It's like, this was about Iraq. This is about Saddam Hussein. If you want to go to war with Iran, have another vote. Can't we have a new vote? But the real vote, the vote of real value, if we were to discuss whether or not to continue in so many wars in so many places, would be the vote over the 9/11 proclamation. I would have voted for the 9/11 proclamation. I think we were right and justified to go after those who attacked us. But after 20 some odd years, it's used to justify war on several different continents. It's not a specific thing. But people say, well, what if we repealed the 9/11? There'd be no AUMF there. Well, how could we live without an AUMF? And my response is, well, couldn't we just try the Constitution for a little while? I mean, here's the point. They think like, well, we need to have the authorization. It's like, come and vote. Let's have a debate. If you want to be at war in Somalia, and you think there's a war important enough for our soldiers to be in Somalia, let's vote on it. If you think they need to be in Niger, if you think they need to be in Syria, let's vote on it. Somehow we lost this conception that we would ever have a debate. But the thing is this is now at least a generation ago. So we have 9/11, 2001. Some people here weren't born probably then. But we're going to let a generation previous bind the next generation. To me, it sort of devalues the lives of our soldiers. We have many good friends in my town whose their sons and daughters serve in the military. Many of my nieces and nephews have served in the military. Doesn't it devalue their lives just to say, oh, well, we authorized that back then, and it probably applies now to whatever you're being sent to do? I mean, if we're going to send young people to war and they're going to potentially give their life or their limbs up for us, shouldn't we have the courtesy to debate the war and have a real vote, and you put your name on the line that you supported the war or you didn't support the war? So it's a kind of a crazy notion that we have an ongoing, eternally alive AUMF from 9/11. And I think it's something that needs to be discussed. So I put forward an amendment on it to repeal the 9/11, 2001 AUMF, and I got 9 votes. So that's the contingency, I think, out there of people who believe in a constitutionally declared war or a constitutional foreign policy. The Democrats were Baldwin, Cardin, Markey, Sanders, and Warren. And then the Republicans were Braun, Lee, Vance, and myself. Braun isn't going to go on to run for governor of Indiana, so we're going to lose 25% of the constitutional realists coming up. But really, that's what the debate is over. And there are some sincere people on it who sincerely believe that we should authorize war, who I think are still misguided in believing that we have to have an eternal AUMF. Tim Kaine is one. He's written about it. I think he's a sincere person, and he makes an honest debate. But I just don't think that having an ongoing AUMF that applies to everything is a good idea. He proposed a replacement AUMF that, in his belief, narrows it, but as we read it, we think it actually codifies war in 24 different countries because it is not, specific enough to try to limit things. And so I really think we should vote. It's a pretty darn important vote. We should vote on whether we go to war. This will be an ongoing battle, and today we are introducing our End the Endless Wars resolution, and that is once again to repeal the 9/11 AUMF, and it would be repealed in 6 months. The reason we give them 6 months, I don't know why you need 6 months after 22 years, but we do that simply because someone will simply argue we have to have some ability to plan for the transition. So we do that, trying to attract more people to the cause, but we still have difficulty. So we have 9 folks. We have many who say, we just don't want it attached to this. But this is a sort of the standard ploy in Washington. They always say, now, young man, that's a really good idea, but this is just not the time nor the place for that amendment. And so some of them act as if they might be for repealing 9/11, but most of them would be for repealing 9/11 only if it's replaced with another fairly open AUMF that wouldn't require us to vote to go to war with Iran or go to war in Somalia or any other place. So I think that's a mistake, but we are continuing that fight. We just finished the debt ceiling fight, and to put it in perspective, because I think sometimes people got attracted to little nuggets and said, well, there's going to be a reform. Look at this reform that might happen if we pass this. Speaker McCarthy said it was the most conservative deal ever accomplished in Washington. Now, I have a hard time believing that because if you look at the big picture of it, it looks like as if we did nothing to change the trajectory of debt. Why do I say that? All of the spending that goes on budget, that's everything but Social Security, on budget. 2/3 of it is mandatory spending, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and a few other items. That's the mandatory spending, 2/3 of the spending. That was taken off the table from the very beginning. So the deal that was arranged between Biden and McCarthy didn't include 2/3 of spending. And that 2/3 of spending drives the deficit. That 2/3 of spending that is mandatory spending is going up at about 5% a year. You can eliminate all of the other spending, not just freeze it, not cap it, but eliminate all other spending other than mandatory, and you don't balance the budget. You might come close to balancing the budget, but nobody's really proposing getting rid of the entire military and the entire non-military discretionary. So you take 2/3 of the spending off the table, and then you get to the 1/3 that's left. The 1/3 they call discretionary, half of that's military. Well, that was taken off as well, and military is going to get a 3% increase. So mandatory, 2/3 of spending is getting a 5% increase. That's just the trajectory it's on. Military is going to get a 3% increase. And then now we're down to half of a third. So we're down to a 1/6 of the budget. And even McCarthy admitted this. When they asked him about the debate, he said, well, what was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to get a deal? I'm only talking about 15% of the budget. Well, it's true, but that's why the deal is of no consequence and will not change the trajectory of the accumulation of debt and isn't a conservative deal and isn't to be commended and should have been opposed. Because it's not going to change anything. 2/3 of the spending's off limits, going up at 5%. A 1/6 of the spending military going up at 3%. They looked at 1/6 of spending, and they didn't even really cut it. They were going to freeze it at the inflated levels that came after COVID increased it by 20%. So we've increased spending dramatically, and they're just going to keep it at an elevated level. And then they're going to increase it from there. There's nothing conservative about this. But let's say a part of you said, well, they tried really hard, and this is the best they can do. And some conservatives will say that. They tried very hard, and this is the best they could get. To add insult to injury, they're already talking about breaking the caps. And my prediction is they will break the even limited, ineffective caps they put on within 2 months. In fact, they made Schumer go forward. They had sort of an orchestrated public shame session. You know how in Mao's China you have to get up and apologize and you read a statement? Schumer was forced to go to the floor. This wasn't well reported, but there was a deal made, and it was under duress, between the big spending Republicans who were going to vote to raise the debt ceiling. It's the same group of people always. They came forward and said, we will vote for it, but only if you go forward after a public struggle and shaming session and say that you will break the caps as soon as you can. They didn't actually use those words, but that's what he meant. He came to the floor of the Senate and he said that the caps will not limit emergency spending. So you have to listen closely in Washington and watch what they're doing, because what they're saying is not often what they are doing. They set caps and everybody's like, we now have caps in spending, except for when it's emergency spending. Well, we spent $100 billion last year on Ukraine. They want to spend more money on Ukraine. I guess Ukraine needs about $50 billion every 6 months. So just be prepared. That's sort of the how fast it's being spent, and they're already clamoring for more. So you've got Ukraine spending. That's going to be an emergency, as if it's not predicted that they would run out of money. But that'll be an emergency. But if you listen to the defense hawks, they're all saying that the military spending, because it's not keeping up with inflation, is a real cut, and we have to add to military spending. So the emergency spending is going to involve that. And then just to try to gather a few more votes, it's probably going to involve disaster spending as well. So they're going to do disaster spending, Ukraine spending, and military spending, but they will break their own word. They will break their caps within a couple of months. Now, to McCarthy's credit, he's saying he's not going to do it outside the appropriations process. So we'll see if that happens. I know in the Senate, they're all clamoring. They're already, woe is me. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined on the military, and yet they say it's not enough. It's never enough. Well, if we had a constitutional foreign policy, it might be more than enough if we weren't doing everything everywhere all of the time. In my caucus, if you come to my Republican caucus, you will hear the beating of drums. These are drums for war with whomever, but primarily China at this point. Everything's about war with China. I was in Hawaii recently, and I met with some folks from our military in the Pacific out there, and one of the high-ranking members came up to me and he said, take this message back to your fellow senators. War with China is not inevitable. And my goodness, shouldn't there be at least somebody in the government trying to avoid war with China, not thinking it is inevitable? We've had an uneasy peace with China. We have an uneasy relationship between the U.S., China, and Taiwan. It's uneasy because it's confusing to explain to people, but the more you explain to people, the less ambiguous it becomes. The whole idea of the sort of situation of the one China policy is this idea of strategic ambiguity. I was in my committee hearing today with Foreign Relations, and every week there's a new bill out on Taiwan. It usually includes harsher language towards China. They want to have a war plan for what we're going to do when China does this and that. But my point to them is the less ambiguous you make your policy, the more you rant and rave, the more you want to make explicit your policy for war, the less ambiguous and less leverage you have of something that was called strategic ambiguity. Is strategic ambiguity great? It's not the perfect thing, but it's a thing that has kept the peace at least for 50 years, and we ought to be very careful. Some say, well, if your language isn't loud, you don't hate communism enough. I don't know anybody that hates communism more than me. I wrote a book called The Case Against Socialism. I've been the leading voice out here saying that in all likelihood, the pandemic started in Wuhan. I met with the representatives from the Chinese embassy the other day, and I said, why don't you help us out here? This isn't just about attacking China on this. This is about trying to prevent the next pandemic. And they looked inscrutably at me, and I don't think they're going to come forward. However, about a month later, last week, the former head of the CDC in China, a guy named George Gao, came forward and he actually mentioned that, yes, we should consider the possibility that it leaked from a lab. This is from a former high-ranking, not currently in the government, but it's difficult in China to speak the truth. The fact that he actually said that, I think, is a sign that there may be some thawing. But my point to the Chinese embassy was this: come forward with it, not because it's a way to beat up on China. We have 12 to 20 of these labs here. There's labs like this all over the world doing the same kind of research. We need to discuss whether or not we should be creating viruses that don't exist in nature and that could cause a pandemic. Thank you. And I think that the next time could be worse. A former high-ranking member of the CDC told me privately that he believes that the next go-round could be a death rate of between 5 and 50%. We actually were extraordinarily lucky. Many people did die. 1 million Americans died from this, or died with this. But the thing is this turns out to be a death rate of probably about 0.3%. That's 1 million people is about 0.3% in our country. Imagine 5% of America dying. Imagine 50%. Smallpox killed 30%. They are doing experiments where they take a virus that exists in bats and not in humans. They take part of the virus from another one that may infect humans, and they mix and match them and create new viruses. And they say, wow, I wonder if it'll infect humans. Why don't we take Ebola and see if maybe Ebola can be transmitted through the air? Wouldn't that be great? Right now, you have to transfer bodily fluids, like with HIV. It's not as contagious. You don't sit around and catch HIV or Ebola for the most part. What if we could aerosolize it? Wouldn't it be great to aerosolize Ebola and just see if we could do that in the lab? That's the kind of craziness that's going on. And most of it's funded by government, so we frankly ought to regulate it. We ought to stop it. With regard to what we do moving forward and how we get better voices or more voices for constitutional restraint, I think the people are with us, frankly. When I travel around Kentucky, I'm up in the mountains and they've had a flood and they've got problems and they need some of the basic functions of government to repair the flooding damage. Nobody comes up and says, I hope you can help if you have any money left over after Ukraine. We really want to support Ukraine. Nobody says that. But even if you did think Ukraine was the last best bastion of liberty and you want to support them, does it make sense to borrow money from China to send it to Ukraine? There's no fiscal sense in this. If we really think that Ukraine and the war is the last bastion for liberty, why don't we have a surtax of $100 on every American and we'll pay for it? You know what? They'd all rebel because most of them really don't want this. The other thing is even if your best concern and your most concern is for the well-being of Ukraine, the country is getting destroyed. Give it another year, it'll be more destroyed. And what do they expect? After it's destroyed, they expect us to pay to clean it up and make it a new country again. There has to ultimately be a peace. The realist point of view is this, that if you expect unconditional surrender, you're not very realistic. If you think wars are going to end by the good defeating the evil, it's not very realistic. The end of the war in Ukraine will be a negotiated peace. I don't think the Ukrainians can completely defeat the Russians, and I don't think the Russians can completely defeat the Ukrainians. My sympathies are with the Ukrainians. I wish they would win. The Russians are the aggressors. And yet, if you look at it, look at the crazy nonsense that comes from people. When Nord Stream 1 and 2 were blown up, they said, well, of course the Russians did it. It's like, really? They blew up their own pipeline? They spent billions of dollars building it over a decade and then they blew it up? That makes no sense at all. Does anybody follow the Babylon Bee? We tweeted them yesterday, and it's a picture of Zelensky with his hands on a plunger, a TNT, an explosive plunger saying, of course the Russians blew it up, but he's got his hands on this thingy that might, The disinformation that comes out about all of this. But I think the public is more with us than you would think. I think that if we approach this from a point of view of that we have limited resources and our primary concern is to our country, when people ask me about any other country, I tell them, look, my oath of office is to my country. I have to first make sure that my country is defended before I begin hopping around the globe and getting involved in others. And so I think if we paid more attention to the Constitution, I think we'd be better off. And I do think that the people are with us, but Washington isn't, and that's why we still need to clean house and get a new Congress as soon as possible. Thank you very much. And we've got time for a question or two. Yes.
Coming over. So do you see progress in regards to China and how it's handling the issue of the coronavirus now after you had your talks with the Chinese embassy?
I don't see a lot of visible progress. The comment by their former CDC, George Gao, to say it's a possibility is the first breakthrough I've heard at all in any help from them. The interesting thing about it, when the information that comes from them, if there are two choices, it's hard for anybody to deny the virus started in Wuhan. Almost nobody says it didn't start in Wuhan. So there's two possibilities, either a lab or the marketplace. Which one would be worse for the Chinese? Probably that it came from a lab, because it either is an accident or on purpose, but probably an accident. But the marketplace is more nature spilling over. Well, they investigated, the Chinese, and pretty much ruled out the marketplace. Nobody in China thinks it was a marketplace. They tested 80,000 animals, including animals from all over the countryside. Their incentive, if they were to be dishonest, would be to point towards the marketplace, actually. And all of their evidence, I think, as far as that goes, I think has been honest, because why would they want to point us towards the lab? Now, they don't want us to believe it's the lab either. They say it's like came on frozen food from a U.S. military base or something ridiculous. But is there a real thought or a change in their opinion? I don't think so, but I keep hoping there would be. I also think that there is room for diplomacy with China, and I think that we need more of it. My opinion of the State Department is nobody in the State Department really believes in diplomacy. It's as if they work for the Pentagon. I want a War Department, but I also would like to see a diplomacy department as well. And I think we would be better off. And it doesn't mean that we countenance totalitarianism, lack of speech, lack of religion. All those things exist, but it doesn't mean we should quit talking to them. I think we should high-level talk with China on nuclear arms, one-on-one. And I think they would talk with us one-on-one. They weren't talking to us in a trilateral way with Russia, because I think our insistence under the Trump administration was that they would have to be, they would have to stay at a level at 1/3 of our nuclear weapons. And I don't think that that's a starting point. They're going to keep growing, they think, until they have parity with us. And I don't know that we can talk them out of that. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have conversation. Maybe one more.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Coming your way right here.
Thank you very much.
I think it's on.
Thank you very much, Senator Paul. I admired your father,
Thank you.
and I have a lot of respect for you, for what you have done so far, questioning the validity of what has done with the recent fear-mongering and COVID, and the question that you asked Dr. Fauci. My larger question is, shouldn't these people who have done for the last 3 years so much damage to the psychic of this country and the world be more accountable for actually the crime that they have done against the public and humanity in a more serious way? Because resigning or retiring is not the answer. I'm a molecular biologist, immunologist, and I was in ocular inflammatory diseases at the University of Pennsylvania, and then I came to NIH. So I know a few things, and I would be happy to help you if you need.
I appreciate that, and I'll have somebody from my staff get your contact information. I think one of the things that came out of looking into the science of COVID and looking at how much government control has over science, the predicate was set for this with climate warming, with climate change. Because it's all funded by government, you don't get funded if you're a dissenter. So when they say there's a consensus and everybody believes this way, it's because it's all funded by one source, and the people who are in the funding apparatus believe that way. It's the same way with COVID. And with COVID, they pretty much ignored basic science. So for example, it's been known since the Athenian plague in 400 BC or something that when you catch something, most of the time you have immunity to it. Not perfect, but most of the time, if you get it the second time, it's not as bad as the first time because you've developed immunity. In fact, that is the principle upon which vaccines are developed. But they came to believe that, well, the vaccines were great, but if you were affected, we don't care what your immunity is. But if you really wanted to sort this out and you wanted to do studies, studies of the public to see what works. Does your vaccine work? If you don't ask the person if they've already been infected or do antibody tests to see if they've already been infected, your study's meaningless. If you do not have a wing for vaccinated, unvaccinated, and also previously infected but not vaccinated, previously infected and vaccinated, if you don't have that in your wing of things, and it got it to the point where on the internet there are just amazing doctors out there just really going through this in a thorough fashion, but none of them are on mainstream TV. None of them, some of them are kicked out of their societies. Vinay Prasad is really good on this stuff. Martin Kulldorff, Jay Bhattacharya. There's a whole group of people that are really good on this, but there is also a consensus. And after 40 years of Fauci being in the same place, everybody there has been appointed by him over decades and decades, and they're of one mind. But this is incredibly important that we continue to go after, and I will, because I do worry that the next accident could be much worse. Thank you all.